Hello and welcome to Geopolitical Musings with Confluence. My name is Amandeep Ahuja and I'm joined today by the CEO and founder of Confluence Consultants, Shraddha Bhandari. How are you
Hello.
today?
Very, very good. Very excited about the podcast. This is the first, so be a little kind to us, please.
I love your energy today.
Well,
All right, so Geopolitical Musings is a podcast for geopolitical enthusiasts everywhere, and our purpose is to simplify current affairs so that everybody understands what on earth is going on. I think the world can be quite a complicated place, so we need something to simplify things for us. And we are aware that the podcast space today is rife with information on economics and politics. So, on this podcast, we're going to be dealing with current affairs and geopolitics through everyday things. So, think about books, TV series, films, and travel.
absolutely. It's podcast with a twist.
Yes, and hopefully that twist is going to be entertaining and informative all at once. So, to do this with me is obviously Shraddha. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. I'll start with a very interesting story. So, this is my undergrad college, first day of college in political science, and a very formidable teacher comes in. She looks at all of us like Severus Snape and makes a prophecy. And the prophecy was there is politics in everything, right? So, yeah, chills all
I
around.
literally just felt chills.
Absolutely. So she said there's politics in what I wear, how I talk, what my belief systems are, what I will choose, who will I choose as my partner, my career, etc. And over the years, she proceeded to prove that that was true. So, I always had this inherent thing in me where I would unconsciously look at politics and everything, and my family was really, really irritated with it. But now it became a conscious bias, as you say, right? So, books like The Next 100 Years that we'll be discussing, The Currency Wars, Descent into Chaos, The Great Game, they became my companions. And I was very lucky that my research interests met with the corporate teams that were just coming up at that time. So I started off my career with a think tank, and then I moved to Barclays Bank, where I used to head their geopolitical intelligence team for Asia Pacific. Confluence Consultants is really an amalgamation of all the trends that have happened in the lives of all of those who are a part of it. So we essentially look at geopolitical trends to help clients make plans for market entry, for business decisions, and just how to structure their companies and operations in a very fast changing world. In short, we help them navigate the politics of doing business.
Amazing. And I'm sure companies listening in, if they are listening in, would be very pleased to hear that there's a simplified way of looking at things as well. And now I have a feeling if we tell them to just read the next 100 years, are we driving business away? Is this cannibalism in action?
Well, so that's going to be, he's not extrapolated it to the economic conditions. That's where we fit in, that's where we come in. The larger happenings, but what does that mean for you? That's the strand that we try to get in.
All right, so let's dive straight into it. So, the premise of the book, The Next 100 Years, is basically predictions 100 years from 2009, which is when the
Absolutely.
book was published.
Absolutely.
And so, today we're going to take a look at some of the predictions that have potentially panned out, that are on their way of panning out, and some things that have gone not quite the way that he has predicted them. So, I know this is your kind of passion project. So,
Absolutely.
tell us your thoughts.
So stop me if I go on a diatribe because I'm really, everyone who knows me knows that I'm obsessed about this book. I like it because it's a very audacious way of thinking. He's trying to combine. George Friedman is the author, and I know a lot of people have problems with a lot of things he says. But he's looking at geography, he's looking at culture, he's looking at demographics, geopolitics, and economics. Though I feel that's been covered a little less than the other aspects, and he tries to predict what's going to happen in the next 100 years. Right. So we're going to go to the book up to 2040s because after that he goes very Star Wars type, where he's talking about shooting beams of energy from space, and then the Third World War will begin with Japan attacking from their lunar mission, the American command center in space. But that might very well happen because the space technologies are evolving. But let's keep it to 2040 because this podcast is for normal people like you and me, and we,
Well,
we
I
we're
wouldn't go
really
so far as to say normal people.
okay, geeky normal people like you and me.
So you
Um,
say that it's when it becomes that kind of galactic level of war
yeah,
and it turns into Star Wars and things. I also feel like this has already been done in film before. This is essentially the plot of James Bond film You Only Live Twice, where it starts with what is assumed to be Japan attacking two American astronauts. So it's already been imagined, and now apparently it's also being predicted.
So that's what films, right?
Yeah,
They've said that there's
geopolitics in
politics in
film.
films. Absolutely. And I think films and gaming, Hollywood and gaming are two places where a lot of these predictions pan out. I think they also give ideas to people.
Yeah.
So I was very worried in Batman when there's that boat scene where they're saying that we're going to kill all of these people if you don't read something, etc. I don't remember the scene exactly, but I thought to myself this would be a perfect idea for a terrorist group to pick
I
up
wouldn't worry too much about Christopher Nolan films because they're quite
above
mind-boggling,
our
and
league.
yeah, I think they're above a certain class of of thinking. So
Yeah, but the people who executed 9/11 were above a certain class of thinking, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, anyway, let's we're in a region where this might get a little controversial, so let's move on with that. So the George Friedman begins with this premise that political analysis and theory does not think very creatively. So he points out to the fact that I think we could look at today. Collapse of the Soviet Union came as a surprise to everyone, where you could clearly see trends, including to the Americans. 9/11 came as a surprise, though. If people have read the looming tower, they would know that it was building up for a really long time. And then a very simple fact: Russian invasion of Ukraine. We all are guilty of this. There was absolutely no reason to assume that the Russians will not attack Ukraine because it's a matter of their survival now, right? So yeah, and
It
that's
it already happened in Crimea as well in 2014. So
absolutely.
just assuming that things were going to calm down and reason dictates something.
Mm.
Apparently, reason has no part to play in geopolitics. Then.
Also, I think that the European powers don't want to think that there could be another war. They've fatigued. They've had a
Hmm.
century of two world wars, then being absolutely nowhere on the map. Cold War. So they were like, okay, just make sure that the Russians don't attack. But anyway, we'll come to that. But I like George Friedman's book. I encountered him first time in 2015, and a lot has changed since that time. So at that time, it was a really far-fetched things that sort of he was talking about, as I said, about 2040s and all. But today, when you're seeing the challenge to the American world order, people are talking about challenge to the dollar, the BRICS, the G20, the ASEAN, etc. I think it's worth reflecting on some of the things he says because it's backed by solid reasoning. Though I think the economics, as I said, is a little weak. So that's where the United States might be caught by
Hmm.
surprise. But just four major assumptions before, and Amandeep, please stop me. As I said, I will go on and on about it otherwise. His first assumption is that the American power is only beginning. Right? So people say it's been 70 years of the dollar, it has to go, etc., etc. His hypothesis is that the American power is only beginning, and there are no challenges to the Americans till at least the 2070s. And you know who he predicts the challenger will be?
Not China, I'm guessing.
Take a guess.
Mexico.
That's right.
Mexico.
So see, you already think like George Friedman. So that's his first premise, and he says that entire 21st century will be about America asserting its power, the smaller powers getting worried by it, forming coalitions to challenge it, and then the Americans getting back at it. So for this, the Americans only have to destabilize. They don't need to get into active wars. The second major prediction is that Russia is going to be the major geopolitical threat to the United States till 2030. And he said this in 2009 when Russia was supposedly making overtures to the Western world and thinking of a reformed Russia, etc. Um, because it is about Russia's survival.
Hmm.
Right. The third one that he makes is again very contradictory that China will be no geopolitical challenge to the United States. And he goes into the Chinese history and the fact that US's strength is its naval supremacy, right? It can fight wars in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. It's got space satellites. China hasn't been a naval power in a number of years. You cannot do that in the course of 20 years. And then he talks about, I'll come to the powers that he mentions, but there is no mention in his book or some of the other very big geopolitical analysts, either what we've been calling the global south. So there's
Hmm.
no mention of India playing a substantial role. Of course, it will be a regional power, a growing economy, etc., but no substantial global role, nothing for Indonesia, nothing for Saudi Arabia. These are just passing references to regional dynamics.
Hmm.
For the European Union, he says that there will be a new EU versus the old EU. The old EU will be haggard states of France, Germany, to a certain extent, Scandinavian countries, though Spain and Portugal would be okay. But the new EU will be Eastern Europe, right? So we'll go on to that. But when once Russia is defeated, Poland will occupy like a central role in Eastern Europe. And the four countries he says watch out for the 21st century, in the way that they will challenge American might, is Turkey, Japan, Poland, and Mexico. I'm going to stop there and then I will let you question me because, as I said, I can keep going on and on.
It really sounds like I started reading the book
Mhm.
and I thought, you know what, let me just wait because it will be interesting to hear sort of the counter theories
Absolutely.
first and then get into the theories. And it's interesting about Russia seeming like a challenge to the US. And I wonder now if it's just an obsession with the past. Is it sort of an obsession with returning to the bipolarity that existed in international relations during the Cold War, wanting that sort of stability, wanting a familiar, wanting a familiar stability and instability that came with Russia on the horizon. And this was also, this is 2009, so this would have been around the time that the BRICS idea was coming up.
Yeah.
So they were strong at that point. They hadn't gone slightly rogue at that point. So
Yeah.
I wonder now if to a certain extent the West in general and the European Union and the US in particular, if maybe not the European Union to that much of an extent, but yeah, the US, is there an obsession with that kind of return? Because at that point, I feel like their strength was a little bit more pronounced.
Mhm. So I think this is not just George Friedman. Anyone who looks at geography to determine, this is the revenge of geography, you are bound by where you are, right? For the Russians, returning to their former Soviet territories is a matter of survival. And I'll just be very brief about this because there's a northern European plain, right, which is right over Romania and Hungary, which is a vast area of land, which is where Russia has been invaded every time. Russia has no defense there. And Russia has no access to ports except through the Black Sea. Right? So these are very crucial. Of course, the Caucasus is crucial, Central Asia is crucial, but Central Asia, they already have dominance. So for the Russians, the worst nightmare is that an American power aligned with any of the powers will come in and invade them.
Mm.
The only way they can sort this out is through depth, which means they conquer more regions. So I'll just give you an example. During the Cold War, the NATO countries were about 1,000 miles from St. Petersburg. Today, they're 100 miles. It's the same with Moscow. So Russia is very vulnerable on its flanks, and the Americans have evoked this fear.
Yeah.
It's nobody is a saint in and I this runs contrary to people who are like, oh, Russia's all bad, oh, America's all bad. There are no saints in geopolitics. And through I think they got convinced when the Americans tried the Green Revolution in Ukraine, and that's when the Russians, I think, got to the point where they realized that they will have to increase their power. The move, even in their, people say that Russia has no industries left. That was a very deliberate move that they did from industrialization to being energy and agricultural exporters because that gives them a leverage with the European Union. So I think the hope was that Belarus and Ukraine will come into the Russian sphere. Russians will use their leverage of natural gas, etc., to keep the Germans and the French in place. And then Central Asia, they're already there. Within the Caucasus, they'll be able to collaborate with Turkey. But I think with Ukraine, that went terribly wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it's an obsession. I think if you say it's an obsession on both sides, for the Russians, it's a matter of survival. For the Americans, they cannot have a dominant Eurasian power. Every time that happens, they're drawn into a war, which is good for their economy, but they don't want to come in till it's absolutely required. So,
Yeah.
and this is very interesting. Again, stop me if I'm rolling on, but this is me. People say that we have no understanding of China or we don't understand Russia. The truth is, I think people don't understand the United States. That's because most of their own analysts, most of their own people are so, they're always in a gloomy mood, right? For them, everything is like about to destroy the United States. The McCarthy era, the Vietnam War, even till 1986, everybody was saying that the Soviets will overtake them. And then 1991, the Soviets collapsed. It may come out because it's an immigrant society.
Yeah.
So you're so leveraged all the time that you think that everything will be taken. I'm only assuming.
It makes sense because the foundation of the country was based on people coming from everywhere, and then it was about survival.
Yeah.
And then it was just about, oh, you know what? We have to stick for each other because you never know what's going to take our freedom away from us. So it just seems like a very paranoid state all the time.
Absolutely. And I think they're also convinced of their grand vision, but they're also very afraid that everything will be taken. And so they react much faster and with a much more concerted effort than anyone else in the world. So I think you will discuss this in your Second World War in color, but the Japanese memoir. So I will just stop here and I will let you talk. But the Japanese read the Americans very well during the Second World War, and yet they went ahead with the Pearl Harbor, and the results were for everyone to see. But America is trying to, I think their strategy is to disrupt rather than create anything. So they talk about democracy, human rights, etc. But they only want to make sure that no regional power can have so much power in Eurasia that they go out and start building the navy, the security forces, start going to their allies. They don't want that. So they disrupt. So what might seem like an American defeat in Afghanistan is just them coming in after the sort of 9/11, creating chaos in the Islamic world, making sure the countries can't stand up together and move on.
That sounds like as good as any victory, doesn't it? You've completely disabled your enemy. You haven't gained anything
Mm.
in the sense of a traditional victory. And people may think, oh, Americans are ruthless, going out for
Yeah, and
meaningless
they don't
wars.
care
Yeah,
because
yeah.
no war, at least till somebody develops in the North American region, no war can reach them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for them, a couple of I mean, I think Iraq was their biggest effort, and that's a couple of thousand people as compared to 50 million in the Second World War, where the United States was only about 1% of the casualties.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very interesting, and I think he puts it, and there are a couple of other geopolitical thinkers who've analyzed, but you really need to sit and look beyond the American media and the American gloom. And yes, as I said, the economy is something that is worrisome. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're creating about 10 trillion of debt every year, which is 10% of I think of their GDP. But till they control everything militarily and they can print dollars,
Yeah.
unless all the countries come together and say, "Hey, want to change the reserve currency," but
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that happening anywhere in the near term.
Yeah. I'm still very curious about Japan because
Not
so
about China.
China is sort of like, I don't know if I should say this, kind of like, like a just a child on some kind of
Steroids.
steroids and just running wild. Like, I want everything. So yeah, before we comment on China, and China could take multiple episodes.
Yeah.
But yeah, curious about Japan because two things. Number one, Second World War didn't really go very well for them when they attacked the US. So I'm now wondering, 2040s you said is when Japan would
That's what
invade. Yeah,
the
so that's
boss says.
that's literally a century on from the Second World War.
Correct.
So it doesn't feel like it's enough time for them to forget.
Mhm.
And Oppenheimer just happened, so it's still fresh in people's minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to me, it doesn't make sense that would happen. And the second thing that comes to mind is they've kind of they've had their period of growth and they had the population problem. So how does all of that amount to let's invade America?
Um, so let's start with some of the things you've said that have not panned out. Um, so he was writing in 2009. At that time, United States, of course, was the first economy, and it was followed by Japan, then Germany, then China, and the UK, I think. So the four economies combined could not match the American might. That has changed. Japan is still the third largest economy, no, second largest economy. Yeah, I think it's. No, I'm sorry. Let me just check this. No, China is the second largest economy. My apologies for that. It's the third largest economy, and but they've had their period of growth. There was a bust, and then they picked up again, right? So when he's looking at the Japanese growth model, etc., that's probably not panned out as he would have thought, but the things are starting to fall in place, right? So right now, the Japanese are probably the closest American allies in terms of the US.
Mm-hmm.
But his prediction is that the Chinese will collapse, or at least the Chinese will close themselves up, become weaker, and the Russians will collapse, right? So that means that the entire Pacific Rim of Russia and Chinese territories are up for grabs. Who can take it? South Korea cannot, Taiwan cannot, Australia is too far away. India is traditionally a defensive country, it's not an offensive country, so it'll only be Japan. So they will have impetus to do this. Plus, they have no resources, right? Everything they do is imported, and oil comes from Persian Gulf. So they have a stake in maintaining control of the sea lanes. They've not done it in so many years because the Americans imposed the treaty on them, which means their forces were only self defense. That changed with Shinzo Abe. They've started modernizing their forces, building their
Mm-hmm.
navy. I don't know, it might get pushed to 2050, but the Japanese are now thinking about expanding. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
again, it may pan out, it may not pan out. We'll have to see how that goes. But there is a very concrete rationale for the Japanese to
Yeah.
do this. They're the only naval power in the Pacific, except for the United States, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting because their defense spending has gone up, but also their collaboration with South Korea and the US also was at a positive point recently. So it would be interesting to see how the next 30 years we'll pan out to sea. Is Japan now deciding
But this
we've
is with the
forgotten?
United States, right? The allies in this war will be their biggest enemies in the next one. So, for example, they collaborated with the Chinese for bringing down the Soviets. The Soviets are gone. China is now the
Hmm.
biggest. So they're collaborating with Japan. Tomorrow they'll collaborate with India
Yeah.
and Korea for Japan. So their major thing is there must not be a regional hegemon in the Eurasian continent, according to the boss, as I say.
Yeah.
But again, makes sense.
Yeah.
And sorry, what was your second question? You said Japan and something else. I think we got so caught up
Japan.
in
Oh no,
Japan.
yeah, no. I was just saying that because Japan has had its period of growth and it's kind of had a peaceful transition to the stability that it has
But
today,
it is
fairly
by
stable.
historically, it's a militarist
Hmm.
state.
Hmm.
You can't say that for any other Asian power. Like
Yeah.
even for India, India is obviously one of the largest defense forces, one of the largest navies, but Indian Navy is very inward looking. A power projection, maybe it'll improve, but it takes generations to improve.
I don't think anyone thinks about India and thinks, oh, they're going to attack anyone. I
Yeah.
don't even think the Indian army ever looks at themselves and thinks we're going to attack anyone today.
And plus, like,
So,
we're bogged down on the borders, right? There's
yeah,
so much with Pakistan and China.
yeah.
And for example, if the Chinese were to weaken and collapse, that would be even bigger nightmare because you'll have these number of states then all around.
So,
So
actually, just on this, and it's not in the book, it's not part of anything related to what we're covering today, but just because you mentioned India, China, and Pakistan, I'm now curious, do you think it's ever possible for Pakistan to forget the Kashmir issue
uh-huh.
and for India and Pakistan to ever establish trade ties so that more than the Indian economy, the Pakistan economy can start to thrive a little?
um, that's a very, I mean, so Pakistan is in a very geopolitically sort of raw situation. They'll always be bordered by the sort of what is called the Islamic world, which he also says, and a lot of people conquer, will remain in some sort of instability. So you can have the kinds of UAE, of course, which is an island of stability, but UAE is too small to really shape up the events. Not
Mm-hmm.
for, I mean, they're like a great city state like Singapore, etc. The Saudis are too divided internally, and plus their geography is not very conducive. So there'll always be some instability. Pakistan will be sucked into that instability,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the repercussions will come in the relations with India. Again, this is something that we will have to sit and hypothesize by George Friedman, but um, it's difficult. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think nobody has really sat down and looked at how the South Asian geopolitics is going to evolve. Maybe that could be a next podcast,
Yeah.
but because it's just really not playing a very global role at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so India is definitely in the lead in terms of the G20, the BRICS, the global South. But when it comes to that power on the table, there's a lot that still needs to be done.
So, based on the readings of George Friedman, what I'm understanding is that the US will continue to be powerful, every other challenger is going to be thwarted, and there's no real threat to American dominance
Till the 2070s at least.
till the 2070s. So, and that's what we're now thinking in terms of the dollar as well, given that BRICS is now expanding, common currency is not exactly a foreign idea. So, are we still thinking that the dollar dominance will continue to stay?
I think the problem really is that geopolitical analysts look at geopolitics, the economic theorists, investors, etc., look at economics only. He's trying to combine that in a lot of ways because he's also looking at technology, culture, etc. But economics side, so he basically says that what the United States is undergoing at the moment. So the biggest thing that people point out is to look at the period of instability in the United States. So for him, it's a period of a 50-year cycle that has started since the U.S. United States of America was formed. So every 50 years, one political class is sort of challenged by another political class because the economic models keep changing.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the early pioneers, the founders who then moved to pioneers. Pioneers moved to small town America, and then they grew rich, and then they moved to big cities, and from there to the industrial suburbs. So that keeps changing, and that causes the friction that you see today. For him, he's not mentioned the deficits, for example, the massive ballooning deficits. He's not mentioned that America has weaponizes dollar. I think by 2009, those trends were not very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
His major thing is that America is the only continent. So there is trans-Pacific trade and there is transatlantic trade. When Europe was in power, the only important waterway was the transatlantic, and they control transatlantic. The Americans control trans-Pacific, transatlantic. Nothing in the world can move without the eyes of the American Navy, systems, etc. It just makes much more sense to be in an alliance with them
Mm-hmm.
than anyone else. So he says yes, dollar, but would you rather than have like the Chinese currency, for example? That's a very close capital market.
Yeah.
So I always ask two things. I mean, definitely the dollar dominance is being challenged, at least in the reserve currency, because it becomes very expensive to hold the dollar in terms of interest rates, etc. Um, but do we, first, the question is there any alternative? They might very well emerge something in the next 10 years. And is there a need?
Hmm.
The dollar seems to be working
Yeah.
just fine. I mean, of course, there are things like the Russians' assets being frozen, etc. So everybody's scared that those could be frozen as well. But you know which side of the line you're in and whether the Americans will sanction you or not. So it's going to be interesting. I am not taking sides either way on the podcast, but I think there is another reserve currency, or I was just reading someone said that in the 2030s there will be a second Bretton Woods conference
Right.
where all the countries will come together and say we want to change the reserve currency. Right. So I mean it's been about like 70s was when the dollar was removed, like
Hmm.
convertibility was from gold was changed. So it's almost 50 years from that. So let's see how these pan out.
Very interesting to see what alternative
What
currency is
replaces
proposed.
it? Absolutely.
Right. I think just in keeping with time, let's move on
Move on.
to the
Yeah.
next piece of entertainment that we can find out there. That's, well, I say entertainment very loosely. It is a documentary.
Mm.
And I know that people out there would rather watch something like Dunkirk or Oppenheimer more
But
recently
this one is
to.
pretty dramatic.
This is
It's
actually
pretty
very
dramatic.
dramatic. So,
Yeah.
a documentary that we would recommend people watch if they're interested in geopolitics and the Second World War. Now, I don't know about you, but I am very much in a state of obsession with the Second World War and how
Mm.
that shaped the
And
order
it's
that we
called
live in.
Second World War in color, right? That's what it's called.
Yes, it's so there's actually two documentaries by a similar name. So there's World War II in color, and there's uh, great events of World War II in color. And I have to wonder, everything about it was quite extraordinarily great. But yes, for anyone interested in geopolitics and the Second World War, this is an absolutely must-watch kind of piece.
I concur.
Yeah,
Pretty
yeah. She
amazing.
was the one who recommended it to me.
Well, my
um,
geeky quotient has just gone up.
so there were actually three things that stood out throughout the documentary. The first one was the episode where they show how the German forces came to treat Paris, specifically Paris and France generally, um, and how that kind of became their place of, oh, I'm kind of exhausted from the war. I need to take a
Mm.
break, you know? So
Yeah.
this is kind of like my second home, my summer home. Just gonna relax here, and when I'm a little bit more entertained, because life in Paris seemed quite normal.
Because they
Um,
surrendered.
yeah, exactly. So it seemed like a very sad time where, you've just given in, and the Germans were just having the time of their lives. And there are pictures that they show of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower, and it just seems very, very surreal and kind of
Mm.
daunting to see like something so ordinary about Paris
Yeah.
with something so extraordinary in front of it. So that was one thing that really stood out, and just how the sentiment of France would have changed
Mm.
with that sort of
From that to
occupation.
resistance. Yeah.
Exactly. And the second thing that really stood out was the Japanese invasion, which we've spoken about,
Yeah.
um, and how it just didn't make any sense.
Mm.
And how also, so, there's always the question, would the war have gone differently if Japan hadn't invaded the US? And would the US have entered the war if Japan hadn't invaded them? And then the third thing was more of a revelation, really, that if the Germans had enough U-boats, they could have done enough
Mm.
damage on the
Mm.
UK to get them to ask for some kind of a peace treaty instead of go for victory. So there are a few things that stand out in the documentary that really make you question, could the world that we live in today have been
Mm.
different? Could so when you think about, would the war have gone differently if Japan hadn't invaded America? I don't think that would have been the case. I think
Mm.
without America it may have taken longer, but I feel like the German and Japanese forces would have been weakened. But now I do wonder if, with enough U-boats and with America not being part of it, I wonder if things could have been different.
So I think a lot of people have asked this question. There were instances during the Second World War, the Battle of Ardennes, for example. The French reconnaissance pilots uh, went back to the headquarters and said, there is an enormous amount of traffic on that entire lane where the Germans were coming to attack France, and they were not taken seriously. If they were taken seriously, they could have just sent their French forces, bombarded the hell out of the Germans. Then at Dunkirk, as the movie says, the Germans could have bombarded all of the Allied forces. They were about 80% of the Allied forces, minus the Americans, of course. But they didn't do it because they were looking for a peace treaty with Britain. I come down to the fact that if you sit down and make a list of what these powers are aiming to gain, what their geography is, and how their history has evolved, we will probably find maybe the events differ, but we may not have been able to change the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans would have had to intervene because
Yeah.
a Germany in Europe or a Japan in Asia would have threatened their very survival. So if not the Pearl Harbor, even there's this conspiracy which says that American establishment knew about Pearl Harbor and they didn't do anything to prevent it because that's the only way the public opinion would have been convinced for the Americans to join the war.
It's like the Coventry conundrum.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it could have been, it's for the greater good.
Yeah. And a lot of people very genuinely believe in that because the deal is and again I was talking about that memoir which so the Japanese general who was in charge of Pearl Harbor, he spent quite a bit of time in America, and he came back and told the Japanese that do not get the Americans involved because nothing gets the Americans together like a war. It's a country that's built out of war. So if they're producing, for example, one aircraft carrier in a month, they will do about 20 of them in a month once you get them into the war. His suggestion was ignored. He said you have to go ahead with it. So he said, okay, but then you make sure that entire naval fleet in the Pacific, which is the center of the American gravity there, has to get destroyed. So they took a very, I mean, the Japanese are very interesting that way because I think this is in their history. The means used and the direction from which they attacked was so such a surprise. So they used torpedoes in the Pearl Harbor where torpedoes are not meant to be in that shallow water, and they took the longest route on the Pacific where they could have been found by American reconnaissance flights anytime, but they knew that the Americans were not expecting that. But then I think there's also the thing that the day they attacked, the American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. Where were they? So it's all up for grabs. What it was, we can go on with that. But if not this, the Japanese wanted East Indies, they wanted Indonesia, they wanted Dutch East Indies, and they could only do that once the Americans are knocked out.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you cannot move in the Pacific without. So it had to come to this at some point of time.
It's very interesting, this general's observation. Nothing unites America more than this kind of situation, of a war. It's something that we've seen after 9/11 as well. America was probably at its most united in recent times on the 12th of September.
And that's the same with Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think Bismarck's basic thing is that the only thing that unifies a country is war. And I think the Germans, the Japanese, the Turks, the Americans inherently are that sort of society, and therefore they're more likely to be aggressors and build empires than the other countries. But I mean, over a generation, I guess that could be built.
Yeah. Travel is another place where geopolitics exists. Let's move on from something rather depressing to travel. So, Shraddha's recently had a lovely time across the Balkans.
Yes.
So, tell us about your observations in the Balkans.
So I'll focus here more on the human aspect because the Balkans has a long, bloody, and very tumultuous history. So I did Serbia and Macedonia quite a number of times in the last 1 year, and Amandeep, they are the sweetest people alive. I can't believe they literally tore each other apart since the 1990s. Just goes to show that when there's politics involved and when this mass hysteria is created, you sort of tend to forget your basic humanity. Um, so Serbia is still that you can see the remnants of the Yugoslav power.
Yeah.
So they're massive structures. They're trying to they still think of themselves as the Balkan powers. Macedonia is like your neighbor, cute little place. A lot of Turkish influence. I was very surprised when I went there. So I stayed in the old part of Skopje, which is the capital. They have a Turkish bazaar right next to it, which is just like the Grand Bazaar in just a smaller scope. And they in a lot of ways, so the Turkey earthquake had happened at that time. So everywhere people were collecting money for that and then sending it to Turkey. The women they need to have their Turkish coffees in the evening. And I think Turkey has very strategically built itself as the gateway to the Balkans. Not so much Serbia, because Turkey and Serbia have a really long history of clash. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Balkan, the Serbian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. But for example, to reach Macedonia, there's one fly the white flight, but you have to go via Istanbul. And some
Ah.
of the best aircrafts of the Turkish Airlines, even though the airport is really small, are kept for that segment. So they're trying to match with the Qatar Airways and with the Emirates, etc., to position themselves as the gateway to
Hmm.
sort of that part of the world. Um, Again, so everywhere as a I mean, I was quite a bit of time I traveled on my own, though I had family, etc. And everywhere I would stop to ask because I'm a very old-fashioned tourist. I carry the map, etc. No phone, nothing. So people would look at me, and I can honestly tell you, and it's so safe. They would make me hop into their car, take me all the way, and drop me to the tourist place. This happened to me in Serbia, in Serbia twice. I got free coffee. In Macedonia, in the bazaar that they have, I didn't have the change currency, and they didn't accept cards. They're telling me, "Oh, come tomorrow, not a problem." So I was like, it's such a cute little place. And we went to Kosovo as well, but unfortunately, the website said that US visa would be allowed, but only European Union visa is allowed. So we were stopped. That was my first stop at any border in the world. But so Kosovo is another ballgame. Kosovo is always so on an alert that the Serbians will attack them, that they're a much more how do I say they're much more wary.
Right.
Yeah, so the Serbians are a little like, oh, we know it's our power, we are powerful in the region. The Macedonians are, oh, we're cute and all of that, and the Kosovans are scared. But it's very interesting. So Macedonia has been trying to join the European Union. The accession started way back,
Yeah.
but this is the politics of the region, and that's why when people say that Europe has not had a war, yes, since the end of Second World War, but the ethnicities are frozen,
Hmm.
the religions are frozen, the nationality issues are frozen. So Macedonia was blocked first time by Greece
Of course.
because because of Alexander. They say that Alexander came from the Greek province of Macedonia. They had to change their name from Macedonia to North Macedonia. The Greeks would, I'm sure there are other reasons as well, but this is one of the reasons. And then the Bulgarians blocked their accession to the European Union, saying there are Bulgarians in Macedonia, that their rights need to be enshrined in the constitution, which
Right.
for North Macedonia is very hard to do. So I mean, I think it's about 2 million people. If, I'm sorry, I'm very bad with numbers, but in the entire Balkans, but
Hmm.
just the level of they will love you. They love the Indians. And very interestingly, ex-Yugoslavia used to be India's biggest trading partner. So Serbians over the age of 65, 70, I met three of them who spoke Hindi.
Wow.
So I think India has done something really well in its foreign policy that everyone outside of the subcontinent loves us. And I'm going to stop at that.
It's so interesting, the power play that goes on with something like accession into any international
Yeah.
organization. We saw that with NATO, we're seeing that with the EU, and just because of North Macedonia, something else is also coming up. I saw something brewing in the news just after India's name change started to come on the news. There was another one about North Macedonia becoming something else.
What will
So
they
I have
become
no
now?
idea what they're going to become.
North Macedonia, no, Northwest Macedonia.
Somewhat Macedonia, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen there. But it's really interesting, and I have never heard of anyone, not even, I mean, especially not a woman, who said that, oh, I just got into a car and I was transported somewhere, got free coffee. And what's interesting about this is that in the existing EU member states, I don't think anyone would ever go to, say, Germany or the UK or
Yeah.
France and be like, oh yeah, Paris. Imagine, oh yeah, I got into a stranger's car and I got free coffee.
There would be
Maybe they would
some
get
other
free
coffee.
coffee. They would get free coffee
But I
because,
think GCC is like, I mean, at least I know Dubai.
yeah.
I went to Doha in January. Sweetest people, so safe. So I think you have to give credit to the GCC countries. I will particularly talk about the United Arab Emirates and
Hmm.
Qatar because I've been here. Saudi I've only briefly touched, but they've built a system where safety for women is tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, people keep saying, "Oh, don't you feel like moving out of the UAE, or don't you feel like moving to the to Europe?" And I was like, I do sometimes, but also I want to go to a country where you have exclusive parking bays for women when you go get your car serviced. That exists in the UAE.
I agree, and not that we're here, but this is an island of stability around
Hmm.
a very wider region,
Yeah,
and I hope it continues.
yeah,
But as I said, they also have a destiny that they're fulfilling.
yeah.
The geographical location, they're so small that they can't afford to piss off anybody.
Hmm.
So they built a culture where they're amiable to everyone. You can be any nationality, come and work for them. And yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm the brand ambassador for the UAE. Everybody teases me that I should be like the official spokesperson.
Yeah, I
But
think you could be.
Yeah, but I
You
think
could do a very good job.
there's one thing that we haven't touched, and that's Turkey.
Mhm.
Again, that's or maybe we should first talk about Western Europe and then we'll come back to Turkey because we were continuing with Europe. Something about your travel.
Something about my travel. So over the summer, I covered some very classic Western European countries: Switzerland, France, so Scandinavian, Sweden, and the UK. And it was very interesting to see. And somehow I decided I'm going to meet new people. I'm going to quiz them. How do you feel about European identity? How do you feel about Brexit? Do you think European identity has changed after Brexit? And what has stood out is that everybody is confused
It's the
in
old
Western
you.
Europe. Yes, it's the old EU. And what's actually interesting about so George Friedman said that old EU versus new EU is going to be a thing, and other thinkers have also posited the same thing. But there's another book called The World in 2050 where the author has said that it's not going to be so much of the old EU kind of becoming a frail existence. It's just going to be that because they're going to be so comfortable in their own existence, they're going to lose their significance. They're just going to exist. They're not going to cause any harm. They're not going to take any harm. They're
It's like a
literally just going.
benign
Exactly,
sort of
exactly. So they're just
existing.
going to be harmless people existing, probably not thriving, but they're not going to be frail. So I feel like that might have already started, where they've lost their own significance even in their own minds.
And I think the demographics is
Yeah,
contributing to it.
yeah, very
All of
likely.
that, yeah.
And you know, every person that I met that I quizzed about their European identity said, "Yeah, I feel so European." And then I asked someone, "Do you feel more French than you do European?" And he goes, "Absolutely not. I'm French." And then, and I said, "Well, if you were to meet someone who's Portuguese, for example, would you then feel like a brotherhood with them, or would you feel like, oh no, this is a person from Portugal?" It's like, no, it's my European brother. And this particular French person, I asked him about the English because that's always curious, isn't it? How do you feel about
Correct,
the English?
correct.
And he goes, "Oh, the English are my brothers." I was like, "Well, that's. Are you sure the English think the same way
It was a
about
young
you?"
person, I'm sure, like a
He
millennial or a Gen
was
Z.
he was 40. Is that millennial? I don't know.
No idea. I am not a millennial.
You are a millennial. Yeah, and he said, "The English are my brothers," and I was just like, "Are you sure the English also feel that way about the French?" And he said, "No, I was very sorry to lose my English brothers to Brexit, and so the impact of Brexit has been felt across the continent or across the union, and it almost feels like it's sad for everyone because they thought it was going to be a promising union, and signs were there that it's not a promising union, and the EU in its integration probably failed the day that people decided to go ahead with a referendum.
Very interesting.
So yeah, it was interesting to see, and
It had a very subdued effect on the
yeah,
continent.
it's almost like, and especially the day that I was having this conversation, it was raining outside. It was kind of gray, and I could see the flowers
It was
outside were
the
kind of
environment.
wilting. And I was just like, I have enjoyed talking to you about this, and you've kind of created the ambiance for this conversation as well. So it's interesting, compared to like your new EU kind of feeling like everybody's nice and everybody's sweet. They'll take you wherever you need to go, give you coffee. That's not going to happen in Western Europe, I don't think.
That's fascinating. I think just to be conscious of time, we could just now sort of start closing up.
Yeah,
We've spoken quite a bit.
yeah.
So just in terms of the flashpoints going ahead and what the stakeholders need to do in terms of wrapping their heads around how world's going to change. I think what happens to Russia is going to be a major thing. If the Russians can sort of carry on where they are at the moment, but at some point of time they will probably weaken. It's already so what I think this is what they say about the Soviet Union and the Americans, that they were a force field that kept conflicts in check. So obviously the Soviets knew that they couldn't move beyond Eastern Germany, and the Americans knew that NATO couldn't move beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So all the conflicts were kept in check. Nothing happened which would take you to a global war. I think Russia, to some extent, had been doing the same thing in Central Asia and Caucasus. Now, when the Russians get weakened, Central Asia is up for grabs. Caucasus is open as well. So the Caucasus is essentially Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, part of Russia. The Turkish are very interested in the Caucasus area, and I think they've been expanding. So their allies, of course, Azerbaijan, have done very well with the against the Armenians because of the Bayraktar drones
Mm-hmm.
of Turkey. And the Turks are also looking at the Balkans. Once if the Russians are sort of weakened and they have to sort of revert back, then that entire area is open for grabs. who's going to control Belarus, who's going to control Ukraine. Serbia is the dominant power, but this might be the time for Croatia and Bulgaria to assert themselves. What will Poland do? What will the Baltic states have really become very aggressive? So that's an interesting area to watch. Asia Pacific is always an interesting area to watch. We'll have to see how China pans
Mm-hmm.
out. Sometimes, the deal is when you're internally weakening, you resort so much to nationalism
Mm-hmm.
that you may have to invade Taiwan. Even though there's no rationale for it, you don't have the navy, you don't have the capacity, the Americans will respond,
Yeah.
but you may have to do that. So that's something that it's very crucial because those are the 70% of production happens in Asia. So those are the sea lanes are very, very important. And I'll be very curious to know how we've not spoken enough about the Global South BRICS. That's going to be the second or the third podcast that we end up doing. But interesting assertion is happening, whether it's just to play one power against the others.
Yeah.
I mean, when the whip cracks, for example, Israel obviously will be an American ally. The Saudis probably
Mm-hmm.
because of the vast defense export. The UAE, I think, has already put its sort of things on the Americans. They're looking at them. The Turkish probably more inclined towards the West, so they're really using the situation very well. India always been non-aligned. Let's see where that ends up going. And Japan, Taiwan, Korea are very crucial, and Australia crucially the Western allies at the moment. So interesting things are panning out. We'll see how that goes. But everybody has to be so. All of this is going to pan out in conflicts localized. What's happening in West Africa. So the companies have to be very prepared of how these global rivalries are going to pan out. It may not be a global war, but a local war is enough to disrupt operations. So yeah, tune into what we say.
Yeah, there's so much about BRICS and China and Taiwan that I really have many, many questions in my head
For yourself.
for myself and for you as well. But yes, in the interest of time, we're going to wrap it up here. And just in the spirit of geopolitics is everywhere, I'd like to finish this with a very short, little quick story.
Go for it.
I have a dog in my house. He's a little German Shepherd, and I had a moment of affection with him where I was just, playing with his face and just thinking about the breed of the German Shepherd. And I thought, oh, it probably has origins in Germany. And I started reading about it.
Yeah.
And then I thought about the term Alsatian, which is still one of the more common names that the breed is known by. And for the first time, it hit me that this probably comes from the Alsace region in France.
Oh my God.
And have I been referring to a French breed as a German breed? And then I started reading about Alsace, and I realized, oh, this is actually in the border of France and Germany. So not quite France,
Yeah.
but it was also one of the last provinces to be freed by Germany after the Second World War. And turns out that immediately after the war, it was politically insensitive to refer to Alsatians as German Shepherd. Of course, now we've come to not care about that bit of political correctness.
We are such geeks. My God.
But as we said, politics is everywhere.
Yeah, so before we sign off,